Thank you to the patrons for supporting the channel. Welcome back. Today we're returning to our deep dive series into all of the SCP games. Last time we talked about the most popular piece of SCP content ever, SCP Containment Breach. And today we're talking about all things SCP-087. Every game based around that SCP. Before we get into that though, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for the support. It has been amazing. We're closing in on 100,000 subscribers, and my FNAF Retrospective Supercut is almost at 1 million views, and it's just amazing. I mean, I've been sort of stuck for the past month and a half about with only my laptop, not having access to my computer, and it's still going to be that way for another half a month or so. So seeing all of this growth, even when I feel like I don't have the access to all of my equipment, has been really great. So thank you. With that out of the way, let's just get into it. SCP-087 is a Euclid-class SCP that was created pretty early on in the whole SCP lore and the uprising of the Wiki. And it's definitely a classic at this point, no doubt in some way because of all of the games that have been built around it. Essentially, it's a series of dark stairs that has no bottom, at least that's been found. Coming from the stairs, wherever the hypothetical bottom might be, is the sound of a child crying, although as you descend the stairs, it never seems to get closer. Exploration of SCP-087 has been especially difficult. All light above the brightness of 75 watts does not work inside of SCP-087, and any exploration of real length has either ended in death or disappearance. The main entity found inside of SCP-087 is 087-1, a face without pupils or a mouth that appears from the darkness, and appears to pretty much everyone who's gone down to explore 087. It usually causes paranoia and fear. If you want some kind of idea of what exploring this thing is like, here's an excerpt from one of the last recorded descents available on the actual SCP file. D9884 continues to scream and plead hysterically as she rapidly descends the staircase. The previously heard static-like screeching seems to overlay the audio feed, beneath which can still be heard the original sound of the crying child. Approximately 14 flights down, the video feed swings to show the area directly behind D9884. The face is now approximately 20 centimeters from the camera lens. It is not staring at the subject, rather it is fixated on the camera lens, giving the illusion it's making eye contact with those viewing the footage. It is important to note that since the sighting of SCP-087-1, the sound of the girl crying and pleading has been increasing in volume, indicating that D9884 is nearing the source. After an approximate 150 panicked flights of descent with 3 visual confirmations of SCP-087-1 still in pursuit, D9884 trips and appears to fall unconscious. Audio feed indicates strong proximity to the source of the crying, and the static and screeching noise continue. Video feed shows yet another descending flight of stairs, indicating that D9884 has still not reached the base of the stairwell. 12 seconds of motionlessness pass before the face comes in full view of the camera, eye contact being made directly with the viewer. So that's the SCP. Something about it just captured the imagination of developers, and it's definitely the most consistently gamified SCP I think ever. There's a reason for that I'll hypothesize about later, but for now let's just get into the games. SCP-087. This is the first SCP-087 game ever made, and presumably the first SCP game in general. Released in 2012, the golden era for horror games like Slender and later Containment Breach, it was a simple and experimental exploration game created by Haversign. It starts with the player at the entrance of the endless stairs as they're instructed by the SCP Foundation that they're going to be yet another explorer for testing. The amount of floors are randomly set between 60 and 150, and some random scary events will occur as you walk down the stairs. Whenever you reach the end that has been generated, the 0871 face appears, jump scares the player, and the game crashes. You can actually glitch the game by hopping on the railing of the stairs and dodge out of the way of the jump scare, but there's really not any reason to do that because, well, the game is supposed to be over. It garnered enough traction for the time. People like Markiplier played it in a couple one-off videos, and clearly a multitude of other indie developers decided that they wanted to make games based off of this idea as well. However, the big hit of SCP-087 wouldn't come until a little bit later. The Stairwell. Here is one that's a little bit difficult to track down the dates around when it came out, but according to what it seems like, it happened before SCP-087-B. This one is a pretty standard and similar to the games before and after it. Go down endless stairs, spooky stuff happens, and at the end you die. It was a pretty early adopter of the SCP-087 concept, though. In 2014, a remake was created, The Endless Stairwell, that attempted to have some sort of plot, but it wasn't very detailed. As far as I can tell, it's supposed to be an almost origin story for SCP-087 before it was discovered by the SCP Foundation. SCP-087-B. We touched on this game a little bit in the last video because it was an earlier game by the developer of Containment Breach, Regalis. It inspired Containment Breach in the SCP theme and the procedural generation, and 087-B itself was inspired by the original 087 game. This one really brought more popularity to the SCP-087 and SCP in general, really joining the ranks with other games at the time like Slender the 8 Pages. This one was a little different than the classic idea. It was a mix of stairs and hallways. Wowzers. After getting to floor 250, somewhere before 270, the player will be attacked by the Masked Man and the game will crash with a random message like, "No," and "It's not a case of whether you die or not, it's when you die." There are multiple entities you can discover in your exploration. The Masked Man, who will attempt to ambush and scare the player and eventually kills you at the end. There's the Red Mist Monster, which is a reddish figure that will appear near the player and has creepy voice lines like, "Don't look at me." And finally, the Cheshire Smile. Now an iconic creepy image for the internet and creepypasta. It's a creepy smile with white eyes, and if you get too close, it will disappear. SCP-087 VR Survivor. Here we have essentially a remake of the classic 087 formula in VR. I believe it's still in early access and has had mixed reviews generally. There's not a lot of content, but a few interesting concepts are explored that relate to some of the things mentioned in the original SCP file. Hunger, crafting torches, sanity. While there's not much to say here, I think an exploration in SCP VR is a really great idea. The episodic nature of SCP, if you want to call it that, means that you could easily have a collection of really simple concepts or experiences in VR related to SCPs. The 087. This is an unreleased project based on SCP-087, described as a more polished remake of SCP-087-B, created by a studio unaffiliated with Regalis. It was going to have a narrative and more story elements, but it seems all but abandoned now, unfortunately. So this is a game that I made. I made it before my big hit, Alphabet Lane. I was just starting my journey in learning Unreal Engine, and while I'm still not good at it now, I was way worse back then. And also, I was like 14. It was for a Game Jam project originally, and then I updated it a little while later. It was very simple, unoptimized, and pretty bad. I had some cool ideas like introducing new enemy types, shadow hands from the walls, a weird creature like the barnacles from Half-Life. I had fun messing with the mechanics of game development, but it wasn't great. You should still be able to get it from the link in the description. The main point that I want to make with this entry, with this game, is that there are a ton of other SCP-087 games that I haven't talked about. There's just too many to get through. But these are the most notable ones. Thank you to the Containment Breach Wiki for basically compiling a lot of these for me to see. Well, let's talk about community and impact. Being the first games built around an SCP concept that I know of, SCP-087 games definitely helped pave the way for opening people's minds and eyes to seeing SCP as a concept, going from this weird internet niche to common knowledge at this point. And the earlier games, like the self-titled SCP-087 and The Stairwell, ended up inspiring SCP-087-B, which would eventually go on to turn into Containment Breach, the biggest piece of SCP content ever. And while these games never reached the same height and popularity as Slender, the challenge of beating SCP-087 and 087-B ended up making it a pretty famous face around the same time as Slender. I think the reason SCP-087 has caught on so much and is replicated so often is because of how simple the concept is, an endless staircase. You don't need to be a master game developer to work on a game based around them. Make it dark, copy and paste some stair assets, and add a jump scare at the end. And guess what? That's not an insult. Despite the lower effort required to execute this concept, it's really effective, and sometimes the simplicity is what makes it the scariest. The unknown of the dark of those stairs, just thrusting you into darkness without any idea of what's going on. It's the reason I think any attempt to really add story or narrative to the games has failed. That's not what the concept is about. It's about the unknown. It's a distilled and honed version of the fear of going down the dark set of stairs to the basement in your childhood, but replicated over and over until all that tension, all that pressure releases in a jump scare. It's a pretty good concept for a game and for a story, again, as long as you keep it simple. That was honestly the part that held my game back. If I had just made it really dark, added some creepy background sounds and a jump scare at the end, I'm sure I would have at least appeared a lot better. But my addition of weird enemies and concepts I couldn't execute well distracted from the real point. The fear of the darkness, the unknown, the endless. There are still games releasing around the concept of SCP-087, but none of them are ever as popular as something like Secret Lab or Containment Breach. But it's still important to look back at these successful concepts and understand why they were successful in the first place. Oh, and side note, people in the last thing corrected me because SCP, the Foundation, stands for Secure, Contain, Protect, but it's a little confusing because, at least from the information I was able to gather, Secure, Contain, Protect is the SCP Foundation, and then SCP, as in a SCP, SCP and then a number, stands for Special Containment Procedures, as in this is something that needs special containment procedures. So there's actually two different ways that you can take that acronym that I know of. So I technically wasn't wrong, I was just leaving out the probably bigger one. So what's next? Well, as my patrons have known for a while, we're going to be talking about Team Fortress 2, kind of like we did with Gary's Mod. It's not a horror game like I would normally cover, but again, like with Gary's Mod, it's a huge part of my childhood and really important to me. And also like the Gary's Mod video, that might take a little bit longer to come out. After that, we're back to the SCP games again. We're going to be talking about multiplayer SCP games like the Secret Lab and all the other multiplayer projects. And then some FNAF stuff I won't spoil yet. But until then, let me know what you thought of this video in the comments and suggest what I should cover next on my Twitter. You should also follow me there because that's where I announce when I'm streaming at twitch.tv/SaganHawks. See you all next time.